Imagine standing in a world where the horizon has vanished, swallowed by endless white, where the sky and ground blur into a single, suffocating void, and the wind screams like something alive, something angry at your existence. This is not just cold, this is isolation weaponized. A frozen wilderness so vast and indifferent that your presence feels like a mistake. And before we go any deeper, ask yourself this question honestly. How long do you think your mind would survive if the silence lasted days, if the cold never loosened its grip, and if every instinct told you that something unseen was watching from just beyond visibility? Welcome back to True Terror Files Official, where we uncover true feeling, survival horror, and psychological terror rooted in environments that do not forgive mistakes. And if you're drawn to real atmospheric horror that lingers long after the screen fades to black, make sure you subscribe now and stay with us, because tonight we are stepping into the frozen tundra, a place where many have survived the cold, but far fewer have survived what followed them through it. And our story begins with a documented winter expedition deep into sub-zero wilderness, where experienced explorers reported something far worse than frostbite or starvation, overwhelming certainty that they were no longer alone, not because they saw anything, but because the land itself began to feel aware of them, responding in subtle, impossible ways, as if the tundra had accepted a silent partner in hunting those who dared to cross it. Extreme cold does more than freeze flesh. It fractures perception, slowing time, dulling logic, and sharpening fear into something primal. And in the frozen wilderness, this psychological erosion becomes dangerous, because every sound matters. Every absence of sound matters more. And survivors of deep winter isolation often describe the same terrifying progression. The first nights are loud with wind, but then comes the silence, a silence so complete it feels staged, unnatural, as though the world is holding its breath. And that is when paranoia blooms, because in total silence the human brain begins inventing movement, assigning intention to shadows, and imagining patterns where none should exist. Yet what makes these accounts disturbing is how often multiple people isolated, miles apart, describe identical sensations. Footsteps that never quite close the distance, breathing that syncs unnervingly with their own, and a pressure in the air that feels deliberate, as though something is pacing them just outside the limits of vision, using the storm as camouflage. And in several survival reports, explorers noted that the wind seemed to change direction unnaturally whenever they stopped moving, circling them instead of passing through, creating the sensation of being sized up, evaluated, hunted. And this is where the true horror takes shape, not as a creature revealed, but as a presence inferred, because the most terrifying hunter is not the one you see charging toward you, but the one intelligent enough to remain unseen, patient enough to let the cold do the damage first. Footprints in deep snow are supposed to be reassuring, proof of your own existence, evidence that you are still moving forward. But in winter survival horror they often become the moment fear solidifies into certainty, because multiple accounts describe the same impossible discovery tracks that appear where none should exist, emerging from untouched. Snow matching no known animal, following at a consistent distance without ever gaining ground. And what makes these encounters especially disturbing is their restraint, because whatever left those prints did not rush, did not attack, did not announce itself. It mirrored, adapting to pace and direction, forcing survivors to question their own sanity until confirmation became unavoidable. And in one especially chilling case, a stranded researcher documented that the prints stopped exactly where he stopped, resumed when he moved, and disappeared entirely whenever he tried to photograph them, only to reappear once the camera was lowered, suggesting not just awareness, but understanding. And as resources dwindled and exhaustion set in, the psychological pressure intensified, because survival became less about warmth and more about endurance. How long can a human mind function when every step forward feels like an invitation, when retreat feels impossible, and when the environment itself seems aligned with something that does not want to be seen, only obeyed? In survival horror, sound is as important as sight, and in frozen landscapes, sound behaves unpredictably, carrying for miles or vanishing instantly, and those who have endured deep winter isolation often report auditory experiences that defy logic. Voices carried on the wind that mimic human speech without forming words, rhythmic knocks echoing beneath ice, where no structures exist, and distant howls that remain constant in pitch and distance, never approaching, never retreating, as if designed to test resolve rather than incite panic. And this is where the psychological descent accelerates, because sleep deprivation combined with cold-induced confusion creates moments where survivors can no longer distinguish between internal fear and external threat. Yet even then, patterns remain, such as the way the sounds stop the moment fire is lit, resume when darkness returns, and intensify whenever the survivor attempts to rest, suggesting intent, and whether these encounters are explained as extreme psychological stress, unknown natural phenomena, or something that defies classification entirely. The effect is the same: the tundra becomes hostile not through violence, but through persistence, wearing the survivor down until survival itself feels like defiance, and the question shifts from "can I escape?" to "why is this allowing me to live at all?" The most haunting survival stories from frozen wilderness rarely end with answers, because the survivors often return physically intact but psychologically altered, haunted by the certainty that something chose to let them go. And that knowledge is far heavier than fear, because it implies intention without explanation. And as we reflect on these accounts, it becomes clear why winter survival horror resonates so deeply. It strips humanity of comfort, technology, and control, leaving us exposed in an environment that does not care whether we live or die. And perhaps that is why the frozen tundra remains one of the most effective settings for true terror, because it reminds us that long before monsters, before myths, before fear had names, humans were already terrified of the cold, the dark, and the silence. And maybe the greatest horror isn't that something hunts us out there, but that the wilderness doesn't need to, because it already knows how fragile we are. And if these stories left you unsettled, share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to True Terror Files Official. Remember, some screams are never heard because the snow absorbs them, and some presences never reveal themselves because they don't need to. High above the tree line where oxygen thins and sound dies, before it can travel, disaster does not announce itself with drum. It arrives silently, suddenly, and without mercy. And before we go any further, ask yourself this question: if the mountain decided to take everything from you in a single moment, would you even realize it was happening before it was too late? Welcome back to True Terror Files Official, where we explore true feeling survival horror, rooted in real environments and real human fear. And if you're drawn to stories where the terror lingers long after the rescue ends, make sure to subscribe now, because tonight we're stepping into one of the most psychologically devastating scenarios imaginable: remote mountain rescues, where avalanches are only the beginning, and the real danger emerges in the hours and days that follow, when victims and rescuers alike are trapped in a frozen world that erases direction, distorts time, and begins whispering to those who listen too closely. And our story begins the same way many real rescues do, with the sudden collapse of snow, a roar that lasts only seconds, and then an unnatural silence, so complete it feels intentional, as though the mountain itself is waiting to see who remains alive beneath its weight. Survival beneath or near an avalanche is not defined by pain alone, but by disorientation so extreme it fractures the mind. Because once movement stops and darkness settles in, the human brain enters a state of panic-driven imagination, where seconds stretch into hours and reality becomes negotiable, and documented rescue accounts repeatedly describe the same early symptoms, lose the ability to tell whether their eyes are open or closed. Voices seem to echo from inside the snow itself, and an overwhelming sense of presence develops, not behind them or above them, but all around, pressing inward. And what makes these experiences especially disturbing is how often they include calm moments, moments of false reassurance where victims feel oddly safe, almost comforted, before panic returns, stronger than before, suggesting that the mind, under extreme isolation and oxygen deprivation, begins creating companionship to survive. Yet some survivors later report hearing voices that gave information they could not have known, such as the exact location of rescuers hours before contact was made, raising an unsettling question: was this only the brain fighting for survival, or was something else taking advantage of a mind pushed to its absolute limits? While victims endure terror beneath the snow, rescuers face a different horror above it, one rarely discussed outside closed debriefings, because mountain rescue teams often arrive not to silence, but to sound unexplained knocks beneath the surface, distant calls that stop when approached, and an oppressive feeling of being watched from higher slopes where no tracks exist. And seasoned rescuers have quietly admitted that certain sights feel wrong from the moment they arrive, as though the mountain itself resists interference. And in multiple anonymized accounts, teams reported equipment malfunctioning simultaneously, radios picking up distorted breathing instead of static, and dogs refusing to advance despite clear scent trails. Yet the most damaging weight rescuers carry comes after the mission ends, when dreams replay scenes they cannot explain, when survivors describe details that don't align with physical reality, and when rescuers themselves begin questioning memories, unsure whether certain moments actually happened or were shaped by exhaustion, altitude, and fear. Because once you've stood in a place where human voices vanish instantly into snow and stone, it becomes difficult to believe you are ever truly alone again. Beyond psychology lies the territory no official report fully addresses, because scattered across rescue histories are details that do not fit into medical explanations, footprints leading away from burial sites that don't match victims or rescuers, faint lights seen moving slowly across avalanche debris without sound, and the recurring sensation, reported by both survivors and trained professionals, that something remains present long after all human life has been accounted for. And whether these experiences stem from ancient human instincts reacting to hostile terrain or from something far older embedded in the mountains themselves is impossible to confirm yet. What cannot be ignored is how consistent these descriptions remain across cultures, continents, and decades, suggesting that the wilderness may exert a psychological influence deeper than fear alone, one that awakens something dormant in the human mind, something that listens when we are most vulnerable, and speaks back in ways we are not equipped to understand. The true horror of remote mountain rescues does not end with survival or recovery, because those who return often describe a permanent shift in perception, an inability to trust silence, snow, or open spaces the same way again. And rescuers, despite training and experience, quietly acknowledge that some mountains never truly release those who enter them, not physically, but psychologically, leaving echoes that surface years later in dreams, in moments of stillness, and in the sudden feeling of being watched when no one is there, and perhaps that is the final truth. These stories reveal that nature does not need to chase us, because isolation alone is enough to unravel certainty, and when humans are stripped of sound, direction, and connection, the mind becomes both protector and predator. And if these stories unsettle you, share your thoughts below. Subscribe to True Terror Files Official, and remember, some avalanches bury bodies, but others bury certainty, leaving only echoes behind. Before we begin, ask yourself this: what happens to a voice when no one is allowed to hear it? When it is locked behind stone walls, written down in ink, and filed away as a symptom rather than a cry for help? Welcome back to True Terror Files Official, and if you're drawn to true horror rooted in real documents, forgotten history, and the quiet terror of the human mind under pressure, subscribe now, because tonight we are opening records that were never meant to be read aloud. Patient files from historic asylums where fear did not arrive suddenly, but seeped in slowly through routine, authority, and silence. And as you listen, remember this: everything you're about to hear was written by real people who once believed someone, someday, might read their words and understand what happened to them inside those walls. The earliest patient records often begin calmly, almost politely, describing reasons for admission that today feel disturbingly vague: melancholy, nervous disposition, excessive imagination, or simply disobedience. And in many cases, patients did not arrive screaming or violent, but confused, frightened, and still hopeful, believing the institution would help them recover. Yet their own words, preserved in intake notes and personal letters, reveal a chilling realization that sets in within days, as patients begin to understand that once admitted, release is no longer theirs to request. And one woman's record from the late 1800s describes this moment with haunting clarity, writing that the doors sounded heavier when closing behind her than when she entered, and that from that moment forward, every sound inside the building seemed designed not to comfort, but to remind her that time no longer belonged to her. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the records changed tone, shifting from structured observations into fragmented thoughts, erratic handwriting, and desperate repetition. And this is where the true horror emerges, not from madness itself, but from what prolonged confinement does to the mind, as patients describe endless corridors where footsteps echoed without destination, nights interrupted by screams that staff dismissed as episodes, and treatments that were recorded clinically but experienced as punishment, including forced isolation, prolonged restraint, and experimental procedures justified as progress. And in one especially disturbing record, a patient repeatedly writes about voices inside the walls themselves, not hallucinated voices, but sounds she believed traveled through pipes, bricks, and floorboards, whispers that began as murmurs and eventually formed words, telling her she would never leave, a belief that staff later cited as proof of worsening illness, never considering the possibility that isolation itself had created the terror it was meant to cure. What makes these asylum documents especially unsettling is the growing contradiction between official notes and patient testimony, as doctors recorded calm behavior on days when patients wrote about being restrained for hours, or documented improvement immediately after treatments that patients described as breaking something inside them permanently. And in several cases, patients pleaded for their own words to be included in the record, insisting that future readers would need to know the truth. And one man, institutionalized for nearly 3 decades, wrote repeatedly that the asylum did not treat illness but manufactured it, stating that the longer one stayed, the more the building itself entered the mind, teaching fear through repetition, silence, and loss of identity. And it is here that many modern researchers believe the most disturbing possibility exists, that some patients were not deteriorating because of illness alone, but because the environment was actively reshaping their perception of reality. The final entries in many asylum records are not dramatic, but quietly devastating, often reduced to a single line: patient transferred, patient deceased, or no further notes, and yet the words written before those endings remain, frozen in time, still asking to be heard. And as abandoned asylum buildings crumble today, investigators and historians continue to uncover letters, notes, and annotations hidden in walls, beneath floorboards, or stitched into clothing, suggesting that even when silenced officially, patients still searched for ways to leave something behind, proof that they were more than diagnoses. And perhaps that is why these stories still disturb us, because they reveal a truth more terrifying than ghosts that institutions meant to heal once created environments so oppressive that the human mind fractured not from disease, but from being unheard. And if these records unsettled you, share your thoughts below, subscribe to True Terror Files Official, and remember, some places do not echo because they are empty, but because the walls are still listening.